So, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I see people coming in from different parts of the world, and such a pleasure to see a lot of you again. Uh, Now, before we start, I just want to share a very quick anecdote, and it's about a banker friend of ours who once in an informal gathering was complaining that as a banker, we know we are selling lies. The person we are selling lies to knows that he's being sold lies, but that person still buys our products based on the lies that we are selling. You guys, on the other hand, are trying to do some work for species conservation, working for the planet, welfare of the communities that live along with the species, but nobody knows you. Few people buy your ideas, and you're always struggling. So, in his words, both of us are doing something right and definitely doing something wrong. I believe what really communicates this well is the fact that I think one of us is communicating the right thing or not be able to communicate the right thing the way we would like it to be. So, uh, given the value of communication, uh, when the Snow Leopard Network and the GSLIP were having this discussion about where do we head next, it turned out communications is what we need to go with. And for that, we have uh, today we have Matthias Fechter, who will be leading us throughout the next 4 weeks. Matt, as we dearly know him, worked with us for almost a decade at the Snow Leopard Trust. He was the communications manager, and then he moved on, and he currently looks after communications in IUCN. So today's session that Matt's going to lead is going to be about um, introductions. It's mainly about the introductions and media relations, and it's all going to be led by Matt. Next week, we will have our own Behzad Larry and Prasenjit, who's a National Geographic uh, photographer. They'll be talking about communicating with images, which, as I believe you all appreciate, is one of the most powerful tools for communications. The week after, we'll be talking about communications, advocacy, social media, and how to engage with whether it's celebrities or big brands and governments and so on. That session, Matt will be part of. But in addition, we will have a colleague, Bermet Tursunkulova from Kyrgyzstan, and myself. And the last session would be conservation messaging, and is about conservation messaging and how we need to focus on solutions than just problems. And this will be led by Julia and Munib. So that's a very quick outline of what we are hoping to achieve from this workshop. And the best part is we are in very safe hands since Matt's leading this. So we, at least I and Justine and Raki and we all can just sit back and let Matt lead the show. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Kostub. Great to be here. Great to see many familiar faces again after quite a while. As Kostub said, I've been in the Snow Leopard world for almost 10 years, and in many ways, it's like the Hotel California. You can never really leave. So when Justine and Kostub asked me to be a part of this, I was super happy to come back to the Snow Leopard world for a little bit. I nowadays work in IUCN, where I'm very much focused on media relations. But before in SLT, my role was much wider. So everything that's communications was kind of on my desk. And so today I would like to do a little bit of both. Talk about communications in a more general sense to start us off. And then the second half would be more focused on media relations, because that's what I currently do and where I probably have the most hopefully useful stuff to share with people. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Just bear with me as we go to a couple of slides. maybe. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. All right, so what we're doing today is an attempted introduction to communications for conservation. Attempted because there's so much ground to cover and there's so many ways to come at this topic and so many things people think of when they hear the term communications, that while we'll try to cover as much ground as possible, I'm sure there will be things that you think of that we may not be able to cover. So to start, I would actually like to hear from everyone participating what communication means to you. Like what concepts, what ideas, what thoughts come into your head when you hear about communications, or also when you were thinking about participating in this particular session. And I would ask you to just please put them in the chat. Take a while, just write down any idea that goes through your head, whether or not you think it's a good one, whether or not you think it's something you want to learn about or something you already know about. Just give us a little bit of a lay of the land, please. And we will, I can actually not see the chat. Let me find out if I can somehow do that. Here it is. Storytelling, that's a good point. Social media. Making knowledge accessible, indeed. Two-way dialogue, I think, is a very important concept that we often can forget. It's actually very nice to read these because they're, in a way, you're all kind of more advanced already, and you're thinking about communications than people sometimes tend to be. And I'll get to why I have that feeling. Just take another minute or so for people to share thoughts, and then we'll switch to a little Jamboard where I trust Kostub is writing these down. All right. All right, here we go. You'll see many of the terms you have just put into the chat, and a few others that other people have said in communications trainings, or that people often mention when they think of communications. And we're going to try to make some kind of sense of them now. So what you can see is different colors here, and the different colors have a certain meaning, being that you can think of communications in different ways. You can think of communications in the sense of activities, which is all the green stuff: speaking, blogging, writing, posting, etc. You can think of channels. Social media is one that was mentioned, media relations, photos, newsletters, etc. You can think of audiences, such as some as the blue ones. Local communities can be an audience, journalists, donors, the general public. There's many possibilities for what an audience can be. And then there is outcomes, goals, which is all the pink, or if that's even pink, that pinkish color on the lower right side. And it's really encouraging to see that the majority of things that you all mentioned kind of fall into that category. Things such as exchanging meaning, making knowledge accessible, achieving mutual understanding, conveying messages, They can also be more concrete things, such as winning a campaign or influencing legislation or getting people to donate. But what they all do have in common is that they're outcomes. And one of the, I think, most important things that I would like to talk about today and would like to shape your thinking as is to look at communications always from a lens of what is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve. Why am I communicating? What's my purpose? So I'm going to go back to the slides and just show you this as a schematic very quickly. And again, outcomes are often neglected in our communications approaches. They're often sort of, okay, it's nice if it does that, but we tend to not think of the outcomes enough. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for today. So now what I would like to start with is exactly this question of the why. Why are we doing this? SNL entitled this series of sessions as Communications for Conservation, which might seem somewhat unnecessary because clearly we're all conservationists. So obviously we're not going to be talking about a bank selling bank accounts or credit cards. We're talking about communication. But it's not unnecessary because in the title, it sort of conveys what the purpose is. Our purpose is always conservation, whether it's doing research, whether it's working with communities, whether it's doing communications as I have done for a long time. It's always for the purpose of achieving conservation. It's a support function. So communications doesn't set its own goals, for instance, except when your manager forces you to set goals. But what communication should always do is support the larger goal, which is protecting, in our case, snow leopards, or protecting other species, habitats, whatever it may be. Now, of course, on a practical level, not everything you do, not every little communications act will directly contribute to that larger goal. But it doesn't have to. You can think of small goals on the way there. For instance, it can be a goal to build relations with donors, because the donors will then contribute to your programs, contributing to conservation. So it helps to think of communication acts and purposes in smaller ways, like step by step. To illustrate that, here's just one small example. Let's say you have a great camera trap photo, such as this one, of a snow leopard family with young cubs. Let's also say the mother is a cat you've been following. You really know this area. You've been researching it for a long time. Now, when you get such a picture, you have a lot of options for how you can communicate that picture and how you can use that picture to communicate. And here I would like to do a quick poll. I think Raki has set these up. I can start them. Please pick all that you would do. And if you have other ideas, you can put those in as well.
Can you read it out to us, Matt?
Oh yeah, of course. So you could, for instance, send the image to the donor who funded your camera trapping to thank them. You could send the image to forest department officials who gave permits to do it. You can post it on social media with a caption to explain what's going on. You can write a blog about it to explain the larger context. You can take the pictures to the local school and show to kids, local community members, or a lot of other things. There's very few limitations to what you can do with this picture. And as the responses come in, I think what we're seeing already is that most people would do almost all of these things, which makes sense. I would too. The thing is, we would do those almost in a way instinctively. But really, when we do them, every single one of those acts serves a purpose. And it's very useful to take a moment to reflect on what that purpose is. For instance, why would you send the image to a donor who funded your camera trapping? It's just a nice gesture. It's the right thing to do. But it goes beyond that. It helps build a relationship. It helps show the donor that their money is well invested, that you're a good source to put money into because you're going to report back to them. So that little act of communication might help you secure future funding. Very similar with the forest department. You might do it because it's the obvious thing to do, but you're also doing it because the forest department official is a key person for you to continue research, and they again can use the picture to communicate with their audiences. So by sending it to them, you're achieving a purpose again. Same with social media, same with blogging. The purpose is slightly different and the way you do it is slightly different, but in every case, sometimes implicitly, but it's helpful if you think of it explicitly. What you're doing serves a purpose, and the more you do it strategically and really think about why you're doing it, the more effective your communication will tend to be. So I'm going to end the polling here. Forest Department, interestingly, has won, so to say. But in this case, it's not really about winning. It's more about thinking of the why and not just doing it. I'm just trying to, oh yeah. So one thing I'm curious about is what else you could be doing to have more such pictures. Because when I was doing comms for Snow Leopard Trust, we would occasionally get amazing pictures, but the majority of pictures we would get were the grainy variety, black and white, a cat in front of a rock wall, just nothing spectacular. And then every now and then you get one of those. Of course, there's luck involved. But what I would be curious to hear from you is, what do you think you could do to make such great pictures more likely? What are some options that all of us can take to make it more likely to have such pictures? I'm sorry, my computer is not doing what I want it to do.
Matt, do you want me to stop sharing the results? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. So what I would like you to do is, if you have any ideas for how you could optimize your photos for communication, you can write them in the chat. But we can also just use the couple of ideas that I've already prepared. I'm really sorry, my my PowerPoint is giving me some problems. All right, there we go. So here are a few ideas for how you could increase the likelihood of getting great pictures. Set a certain number of extra cameras where you know the cubs are living, for instance. Set them in a way that they show a beautiful panorama rather than a rock wall. Use high resolution, use video, use color cameras. The reason I'm talking about this is not to give you, pointers for how to do camera trapping, but rather to make a point that I think is important in communications. And that point is that these things can only be done, you can only get those better photos if you think of these things ahead of time. If you go out and you do your camera trapping for science without thinking of any of those points, you're not going to be able to then go back and change what you've done. And this is how often it happens in conservation projects when it comes to communication. We do this. What we see here is a very simple schematic for how a project planning could look. You have an idea or a need, a threat that needs to be addressed. You budget for how to implement the project. You raise the funds, and then you implement. I'm sure many of you have done this multiple times. I've been involved in this multiple times. It's a very simplified timeline, of course, but it's one we very, very often follow. And then what happens very frequently is, once we've done our project, we think of a communication strategy. So now we have an outcome. We have camera trap pictures. We have a study result. Maybe a paper has been written, or maybe a community has set aside land to help ungulates graze. Whatever it may be, we have an outcome. And now we think of, okay, how do we communicate this? Maybe we have to because we promised the donor that we will do it. Maybe we haven't really promised about anyone or haven't thought about it, but we're like, oh, maybe we should communicate because, you know, why not? It happens all the time, but it's a problem because it prevents you from really maximizing the potential of communications. So what I would like you to try and do instead is this. Move communications forward, make it part of your planning, because it will allow you to think about how communications can help you achieve your future goals. So when you plan a project, think of how can it help me achieve my goals? And then as a follow from that, what communications products will I be needing to do that? What kind of budget do I need? For instance, I might need to bring a photographer to my project site, or I might need to buy extra cameras, or I might need to budget for a graphic designer to help me put whatever the outcome is into a visual format. I might need skills, equipment. I might need time resources, especially in larger organizations. Very often, you know, you have to budget for the time of your colleagues, such as fundraisers or communications professionals. And frequently, even in big organizations like IUCN, that doesn't happen. And so at the end, you're like, oh, we have a report, please communicate. But we did not set any budget aside. So the more you avoid doing that, the more you can actually have effective communication around your project. And one thing that's really important that also follows from this is by planning for communications early, you can also plan for how you need to document your project. Let's say you do an education camp for kids, for eco-education. That camp takes a week. Once it's over, you've basically missed your chance to collect photos, videos, interviews, anything that you might need in the future to communicate. You need to know in advance that you're going to use it. So if you only take one thing away from this introduction, it should be this. It's think of communications early and think of why you're doing them. Because everything else, your audiences, your channels, your tactics, your timing will follow from this. And very often it's the other way around, and that is a missed opportunity. So at this point, instead of me talking endlessly, I would like to take some questions before we move to the next topic. You can either take the floor and ask through the mic, or you can type into the chat if you have things that just sort of pop into your head as questions, and we'll take a moment to answer whatever we can.
Matt, I think there's a very nice point in the chat window by Sibyl. And Sibyl says, I think one of the problems with snow leopard images on social media is that the super cute pics are usually from zoos. In fact, I think we need to be more clear in tagging images on how to communicate they are from the wild and why that is important. I think that's an interesting point,
completely agree.
Can have can be discussed a little bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. And maybe Sibyl, you want to say a few words more about this, because I know you've worked a lot with photos and with these things.
Yes, it's interesting to me over the years how certainly on social media, members of the public don't seem to differentiate between snow leopards in the photos of snow leopards in zoos and snow leopards in the wild, and that I often wonder about that and what impact, you know, it has on our ability to really communicate the conservation message. And I guess, I mean, there's a whole topic around that anyway, of the cuteness factor and whether people are really engaging how much they're engaging in a meaningful way, if it's the cuteness factor that's all that they are interested in. But of course, you know, years ago, the only photos we did have were from zoos. And so this is totally understandable. But the technology now is just so fantastic that we are able to really go into the lives of wild snow leopards. But I really would like on social media to see more of the NGOs and more discussion around the importance of sharing photos that may not be fantastic because they were taken in the wild, but they truly represent what it is we're trying to do, i.e. help this species and its habitat.
I think that's a really, really good point, and it, in a way, it goes back to the first thing I mentioned today, which is again the why. Why are we putting pictures on social media? What's the purpose that we're trying to achieve with such posts? And I think very often when I set out at Snow Leopard Trust, we didn't really think about that, at least not in a very deep way. It's okay, we have cute pictures, we want people to know about us, so let's post them. And that worked. You know, those beautiful pictures got a lot of likes and a lot of shares and a lot of engagement. But that's where it ends. Right? Nothing really further happens. I mean, in some cases, these people become donors and it's important and you engage with them. But there's not much more happening afterwards. The question is, does there have to be? Is the social media channel the right place to reach people who can take more meaningful action? And I would wish it was, but I have my doubts that it is. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing what you said and share wild snow leopard photos, but I think it does help to manage your expectation of what the outcome is going to be. Because as much as you want to convey these conservation messages, if the audience, or even if the audience is receptive to them, they're not the people whose behavior needs to be changed in many ways, at least some of them. And so it might not actually help us achieve the purpose. That said, I think making the differentiation is extremely important, and explaining to people that, you know, what you see is a zoo picture and there's a reason for that, because you can get close to the cat, and in reality that's not at all the case. We did that as a conscious decision in my time at SLT. We kind of shifted away from zoo photos to camera traps and other wild pictures as we got more and more of them. But to this day, I'm not sure if that was the right move, because as we did so, engagement levels went down on social media. The donations didn't go down, they kind of stayed stable. But it didn't happen with a lot of strategic thinking around it, sort of more instinctively. And I would be curious what you think and what others think on you know, what the point is of doing social media with a conservation message when really the best you can hope for is likes, and whether you should invest that activity and that resource somewhere else.
I think you've made a really good point, and I guess at the end of the day, I always felt that social media was around educating, potentially for people not to buy goods from endangered species animals and endangered plants and so on. That's a really simple, big one that we can all be part of, to educate people. Don't buy this fur, don't buy these parts, don't buy these animals, don't buy, you know, that sort of thing. Otherwise, you're right, it's probably quite limited as to what we're expecting members of the public to be doing.
Just to add on that, I think, which is a great point you guys are both discussing, perhaps though increasingly with tourism in snow leopard habitats, there actually is a role social media plays, because as I'm sure Behzad and Kosta will talk about in the image session, people are getting very close to snow leopards, right? So I think even with wild pictures, it's important to be clear about how those photos were taken, and the process of not the individual wasn't disturbed, or how close it was, to highlight those issues that you're talking about, zoo images, because there's a conservation angle to that too, right? Because increasingly everyone just wants that that image of them with the snow leopard, but maybe disturbing them, or leading to encroachment and all that. So the messaging of wild images can also have such messages. And since people are going to in tourism areas to snow leopard habitats, maybe the wider public can be engaged in that. And I think increasingly everyone in the world is on social media, right? So even people in snow leopard habitats are increasingly. So maybe social media is having a bigger role than previously. I don't know. I would swing more to the other side, Matt. I think you're a pessimist.
No, I think you're making a great point, Justine. My only sort of counterpoint to that would be, you're not going to be able to achieve all of these different purposes in one channel. If you have something like the SLT Facebook page with 1 million or so followers, you're going to have 1,000 people there who are potentially doing snow leopard tourism, or who even live in snow leopard habitats, or who might buy a snow leopard fur and could be persuaded not to. And then at the same time, you have donors, and you have just a whole bunch of people who just like cute snow leopards. And if you have this sort of one size fits all kind of channel, I think these messages get lost. And what is probably a more promising approach is to try and be more targeted. I think absolutely, I agree with both what Sybil said about trying to educate people on their own behaviors, and what you said in terms of tourism going to the wild. But I do think you need to do that in a targeted way, where your messages, your channel, your entire approach is focused on that purpose. And often social media channels tend to have, they try to sort of capture everything and serve every purpose simultaneously. And when you try to do that, usually you fail at all of them, to some extent at least, is my impression.
Yeah, thanks. Are there more things in the chat? But I also saw Bedside was unmuting. I saw, because he's a co-host, he can't raise his hand. But I don't know if Bedside, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, no, because you mentioned tourism. Sorry, our dog's barking. So with a lot of expectations that people see on social media, you also get people who have expectations of zoo-like images when they're out in the field. And we have seen a lot of tour operators actually use images from the zoo in Geneva and from a zoo in New England, where photographers have gotten really good, nice, close images of these animals, and from game farms in Montana as well. And so when tour operators use these zoo images or captive animal images to sell, photo tours to snow leopard habitats, it is a problem, because people come with these expectations of being able to recreate this. So, we write and talk extensively about having the right expectations, and it's okay to have, if you do see a snow leopard, it's perfectly fine, and in fact great to have an image from 2 kilometers away with the snow leopard walking down a mountain on a skyline. So expectations are key. So I get both points off this, but it is true, targeting a certain audience is important when you're looking at social media, because you can't have an audience which consumes everything all the time, because then it just becomes too general and vague.
I think the question Flavia is asking, irrespective of social media and likes and engagement, goes in the same direction. It is more difficult to get engagement for conservation-focused messages, and it is even more difficult if you don't boost them with a very cute image of your charismatic species. The question, though, is what purpose does that engagement serve if you do get it? Like, let's say you get 500 likes for a cute jaguar picture, a cute snow leopard picture. What good does that actually achieve? Whereas maybe you get only 10 likes, but they're 10 likes from people who actually meaningfully engage with your content. If you share something that's more conservation focused, that gives more of a, an idea of the real situation on the ground, or as Behzad said, you show a picture that's actually realistic to achieve rather than some pipe dream. If you do that, you have to accept the fact that you're going to get less engagement, you're going to get less likes in pure numbers. But I would argue that the engagement you do get for these kinds of messages is much, much more meaningful. And the way to maximize that, I think, again, is targeting the right kinds of people. And the way to do that, in my opinion, is make your channel focused on the thing that really matters to you. I'll give you an example from where I work now, IUCN. I don't do social media there, but I work closely with the social media team. The decision was made about 2 years ago to completely shift the strategy away from maximizing, the audience, getting as many likes as possible by just posting beautiful nature pictures, and more towards reaching relevant audiences with relevant content and really engaging in some kind of an exchange where they don't just click like because it's a nice picture, but they actually read what you're writing. They click on a link. They might comment. They might have something to contribute. As a consequence, the number of followers, the number of likes, all of these things have gone down. But the engagement that happens is so much more meaningful than it was before, because the people that follow now and the people that engage, they have now learned to expect relevant content from us. So they actually care when we post. Well, not all of them, obviously, but many of them. Whereas in SLT, when I was there wasn't really much of such a focus, and we got huge numbers of likes and huge numbers of followers, but relatively rarely was there meaningful engagement. And if it happened, it was always with the same 10, 15, 20 people. And I think looking back, and if I was still there now, I would probably start arguing for, let's forget about 100,000 followers. Let's focus on the 100 that actually matter. And I think that's, if you want that kind of meaningful engagement, that's the direction to go into, and to really shape the whole channel and the messaging and the content in such a direction. And I would be very curious to hear what others who have experience in these fields think about that.
Thanks, Matt. I think that's a really good point about thinking about what we want from our followers. As a light point, sometimes when we apply to donors, so it might not be important that the followers are engaging so much, but sometimes when you're applying to donors and saying that you have a huge reach, sometimes helps in that as well, because sometimes you're like, we have like 1 million followers on all these social media platforms. We can reach out to all these people and spread awareness, that kind of a thing. So sometimes numbers work if we're not if we are looking for donations outside social media, when we're applying for grants and things like that. So when it comes to those contexts, like how do we balance that, like numbers matter when we're applying for grants versus meaningful engagement?
I think that's a super good point and a very important one. And yes, you do have to, in some cases, focus on the numbers. I think what we really should do as a conservation community, though, is educate the funders and really try to get them to understand what the meaningful ways of measuring things are and which ones are not that meaningful. There's a lot of vanity measures out there. Like, yeah, we have 1 million social media followers. So what? It's very similar with media relations. Almost every donor either demands or is often promised there will be a press release about the project. It's kind of just a default. We just do that. But is that really the best way forward? Does it make sense to do a press release? Does it make sense to post about the project to 1 million people who don't actually really care, because that's not what they're there for? If they're on our page to see the cute pictures from zoos, are they even going to notice that content? Are they going to interact with that content? So I think obviously we can't just, dictate to funders how we would like things to be, but it is important that we have these conversations with them, with the, especially the more engaged foundations that have been partners over the long run, that we work with them on finding the metrics that actually matter and that are impactful, rather than just some big number that, checks a box but doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah. Matt, can I just mention a quick story? I don't know if you were at SLT in 2013. Yep. But at that time, there was a really good example of how numbers did actually matter. You might recall I found a listing for a snow leopard coat on Etsy, and started looking at what was available on the Etsy platform for sale. And, there was a huge amount of endangered species product. And I contacted Etsy, and their response was, well, this is not our problem. We're a platform, we're a channel, we don't regulate the message. But Brad Rutherford obviously felt very differently, and he started amongst the SLT social media, he started a petition, and within 3 or 4 days, it got about 40,000 people signing. And then he took that petition to Craig Anderson, I think his name is, was the CEO of Etsy, and they changed their policy as a result of that. So there are times when you can mobilize those people who love the cute photos. I agree, it's not always the case, and it's tricky, but that was one example where numbers of that audience, which was not normally engaged, really stepped up.
I totally agree, and I actually worked on that campaign a lot with Brad, so I remember that whole thing very well. And I think it's a really good example. What I will say is I think it worked because that's the kind of thing that a social media mass audience does and likes to do and cares about. You're not going to get them to, well, you can't, because they're not the right people for it, to, let's say, be more mindful of snow leopards in tourism areas, because the vast majority of them will never set foot there. You're definitely not going to get them to work on wildlife conflict because they're not living with these animals. So these kinds of conservation messages are lost on this audience because they can't do much about it and they don't care much about it. Whereas this, signing petitions, doing things in their own lives that they have influence over, is very much what a social media audience can help you with. So maybe I shouldn't have said, numbers don't matter. You're completely right. Numbers do matter for certain things. And if that's what your organization does, if you're a campaigning organization primarily who tries to achieve this sort of change, which happens less maybe in the species habitat and is less about protecting and more about consumer behavior, absolutely large social media numbers are very, very valuable. But again,
it gets to your point that you have to know what you're trying to
exactly.
achieve.
And sometimes you have, you might have different purposes and you can't achieve them all. And if you're a very large organization, you might be able to cultivate different audiences with different types of content exactly for this kind of purpose. So it always comes down to what are you trying to do? And is the channel you're using the appropriate one to reach the kinds of people who can help you achieve what you're trying to do? And in the Etsy example, yes, social media was absolutely the right channel to achieve that. But if you're trying to do on-the-ground conservation, it might not be.
Hey, Matt, just wanted to add one more point, and it's a little bit of a counterpoint to what you're saying, that do we really need to engage with a large number of people who may not ever go to a snow leopard habitat or whatever. But just a counterpoint would be the biggest problem of conservation fraternity is that people don't care. People don't even know what's there to care for. Why should they care for? And on that front, don't you think it makes sense to have a taxi driver, a shopkeeper, a prime minister, a finance minister at least be aware of what of these issues? And yes, you may send out 100 messages and one might stick, but I think that's the chance we have to at times take. Ultimately, if one has to make conservation mainstream and not something like a hobby or a corporate social responsibility or something that they treat as bottlenecks, then to make that issue a mainstream, you have to start reaching out to an audience which you have no idea about. And who knows how many, yes, I mean, the rate of engagement, as they also measure in many of these metrics, is going to be very low. But in many ways, it might at times be worth that extra effort to reach out 1 in 100 who might take action. So I'm just, I mean, again, not truly a counterpoint, but just an add-on to this, that yes, a target is important, but ultimately, I think we all are aware of the fact that conservation has to be mainstream, where everyone should care as much about it in an ideal world as we claim to do, right? So that's the other point I want to add.
Just two things I think about that. I mean, yes, obviously you're right. We do need that, but I would say ideally we would want it to be a bit more targeted than just people being aware, because raising awareness is often used as a goal in and of itself, but I don't think it is. It's a step. You want people to be aware in order to affect change, and it's helpful, I think, to think about how does that happen. It could be through a political campaign. It could be through specific behaviors, or it could be by electing the right kinds of people into positions of power. And if you want to do that, if that's a purpose that you think you can take on as an organization, which if you're a small research organization is very, very challenging. Again, I think you're going to be more effective if you do it strategically and with a clear purpose in mind. And if you want to move the mass audience to take a certain specific action, you almost want to take them by the hand and kind of lead them there. Because just because the taxi driver in Bishkek has seen snow leopard pictures and finds them cute, that's not enough. He then needs to, or she then needs to, vote for the right people, or participate in public consultations, or sign a petition, or do something beyond just being aware. And maybe we can help achieve that purpose, but only if we're aware of what the purpose is.